There exists a stage in the awakening journey that remains largely unspoken, uncelebrated, and rarely acknowledged. It arrives after illumination has occurred, when life no longer holds its former shimmer, when the previous drive for achievement, recognition, identity, and mere survival crumbles away. What emerges instead is something considerably weightier, not despair exactly, but rather a profound, dense stillness that murmurs an unsettling truth within. I have no wish to die, yet I have no desire to exist either. The common expectation is that awakening brings clarity and purpose, but for many it resembles the ground vanishing beneath their feet. The personas you inhabited cease to hold meaning. The narratives that once energized you lose their potency. You continue functioning, handling responsibilities, preparing meals, engaging with others. Yet something fundamental has already withdrawn from the game. You don't experience suicidal ideation, you feel post-survival, as though the aspect of yourself engineered to pursue life has quietly resigned. This is where ego death transitions from poetic concept to visceral reality. Carl Jung never portrayed awakening as a continuous ascent into radiance. He cautioned that when the former self disintegrates, there exists an extended interval where meaning dissolves before it reconstructs itself. The psyche dismantles its previous framework before constructing a new one. And throughout this dismantling, the nervous system doesn't experience enlightenment. It experiences disorientation, emptiness, suspension in a silent anteroom between your former identity and your emerging self. The desire not to exist originates here, not from death-seeking, but from releasing attachment to being someone. For years, your ego maintained your momentum through desire, fear, ambition, comparison, and yearning. Even suffering provided structure. Then awakening arrives and the structure liquefies you perceive through the illusions that previously motivated you. You recognize the facades. You detect the unconscious patterns. You sense the mechanical nature of existence. Suddenly, the question transforms from how do I succeed to why engage at all. This represents not pathology or deficiency, but a threshold state of consciousness. In-depth psychology, when the ego dissolves more rapidly than the deeper personality can reorganize, the psyche enters a vacuum. Within this vacuum, nothing registers as urgent. Nothing carries meaning in the familiar way. The will detaches from survival-oriented objectives. Desire falls silent, not because it is damaged, but because it no longer recognizes the old targets as genuine sustenance. Externally, others may perceive you as sliding into apathy or depression. Internally, what you experience is stranger. You can perceive reality with unprecedented clarity, yet feel no pull toward it. There is awareness without hunger, presence without grasping. You are awake, and precisely because of this, existence feels optional. Spiritual traditions identify this as the death of the false self. Buddhism addresses the dissolution of craving. Mystical Christianity describes the extended purgation between selves. Sufism names it the annihilation of personal will. Jung mapped it psychologically. When the ego releases its grip, the unconscious floods in. When meaning was previously ego supplied, its collapse resembles losing gravity. This explains why the desire not to exist feels so perplexing. It carries no violence, no urgency, no anguish. It feels neutral, flat, almost peaceful enough to be mistaken for tranquility, but not quite. It represents the sense that your old contract with life has expired while the new one remains unwritten. Many at this juncture fear they've regressed. They seek ways to feel normal again, attempting to resurrect motivation, attraction, and appetite. But what they're actually mourning is the death of their former psychological engine. The system that once operated on fear and craving can no longer fuel the next phase of their evolution. The nervous system hasn't yet learned how to function without appetite. So existence feels heavy, not painful, not pressing, simply unnecessary. Days proceed, you function, you communicate, you eat, you work, but the old inner affirmation of life has vanished. In its absence, a frightening neutrality establishes itself. This is where many confuse transformation with breakdown. But breakdown constitutes only the initial movement. The psyche cannot remain in the vacuum indefinitely. Something more ancient than survival begins stirring. A layer beneath the ego, a layer that doesn't live for validation, performance, or fear, starts organizing silently until it is prepared to emerge. You remain in the in-between, alive, aware, unattached, and secretly awaiting a meaning you can no longer manufacture. After the old psychological engine powers down, the body registers it first. The mind may comprehend what occurred, but the nervous system is bewildered. For years it learned to operate based on pressure, urgency, identity, reward, and threat. Now those signals weaken. The body awaits instructions that no longer arrive. This is where many experience hollowness, flatness, and distance from life's hunger itself without understanding why. Psychology frames this as regulatory shock. The ego once provided constant stimulation, goals, fears, fantasies, tension, and pursuit. When that structure dissolves, the nervous system drops into low arousal. It is not depression in the conventional sense. It is deconditioning. The system is unlearning its addiction to survival-based motivation. From a spiritual perspective, this stage represents the death of compulsive becoming. The mind no longer races toward its next version. The identity that needed to prove its value has loosened. The will sculpted by deficiency has exhausted its fuel. And instead of immediate freedom, what arrives first is silence within movement. This explains why the desire not to exist feels bland rather than tragic. It is not about escaping pain, but about the absence of inner pressure, no internal push, no chase, no urgent pull toward the future. The personality persists, but the driver has vacated the seat. In Jungian terminology, this is when the ego no longer dominates the psyche, but the self hasn't yet assumed authority. The conscious mind floats without an organizing center. The internal hierarchy dissolves before reordering itself at a deeper stratum. This is why people say, "I don't feel like a person the way I used to." That is not metaphor. The psychological structure that once defined personhood is literally rearranging. Other psychological frameworks describe similar processes. In existential psychology, this is the collapse of meaning structures. In trauma, in form therapy, it resembles a freeze response without fear. In transpersonal psychology, it is called a non-ordinary state of consciousness. Different vocabularies, identical terrain. The danger isn't that the desire not to exist appears. The danger is when the mind interprets it through the old survival lens and concludes something has malfunctioned, because from the old ego's perspective, stillness registers as failure. The ego was designed to strive. When striving dissolves, it panics, labeling the void as illness, regression, or loss. But from a deeper psychological position, this void isn't absence. It is unoccupied space. And unoccupied space is where the deeper personality can finally assemble without interference. This is why forcing motivation back seldom works. Attempting to resurrect your old self intensifies inner conflict. You're asking a dissolved structure to resurrect itself in a psyche that has already outgrown it. The nervous system resists because it recognizes something irreversible has occurred. What actually begins developing here is a quieter mode of being, a way of functioning that doesn't originate from hunger, lack, or fear. Initially, it feels empty because it doesn't communicate in cravings. It communicates in subtle orientation. You may notice faint shifts, sensitivity to what feels false, intolerance for internal contradiction, withdrawal from meaningless patterns, attraction to simplicity without effort. This stage feels disorienting because it offers no dopamine, rich signals, no dramatic pleasure, no rush of becoming, just an unfamiliar neutrality that gradually reshapes perception. Spiritual traditions describe this as the desert phase, not punishment but preparation. The excess noise of the psyche has been stripped so a different intelligence can surface. Jung described this as the withdrawal of projection, when the soul no longer externalizes its meaning onto people, achievements, or future fantasies. When projection retracts, the world loses its glow. But what replaces it isn't darkness. It is depth without decoration. This is also why relationships feel different. You may no longer feel compelled to perform, impress, cling, or merge. Old emotional strategies collapse. You begin seeing people without the filter of need. And that can feel isolating initially because need was once the invisible adhesive holding everything together. The desire not to exist is therefore not a wish for disappearance. It is the psyche's way of declaring, I no longer recognize myself in the old shape of life. You remain alive, present, aware, but the reference point that once defined existence has dissolved. Until a new center stabilizes, life feels suspended between meaning and neutrality. This isn't where the process concludes. This is where the deeper reorganization begins. What eventually shifts isn't motivation in the old sense. What returns is orientation, not the restless urge to become someone, but a quiet recognition of where life now wants to move through you. This is the moment Jung described as the emergence of the self, as the new organizing center of the psyche. The ego no longer operates the system, but it still exists, now in service rather than command. The desire not to exist fades, not because life suddenly becomes thrilling again, but because existence is no longer experienced as a personal burden. It becomes participation rather than effort. You still experience fatigue, you still encounter limitation, but the inner resistance softens. You stop contesting being here. This is where many misunderstand integration. They assume awakening culminates in bliss. In reality, integration is the gradual shaping of a life that can hold the consciousness you now carry. The psyche must learn how to function without the old fuel sources. A new form of energy begins replacing them, not driven by hunger but by inner alignment. Meaning returns differently now, not as ambition, not as fantasy, not as identity. Meaning becomes relational rather than performative. You may sense it when something quiet feels true, when a choice feels clean, or when your body relaxes into an action without internal negotiation. This meaning doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't promise greatness. It simply feels honest. Spiritually, this is the movement from awakening to embodiment. Awareness is no longer an escape from the world. It becomes the way you inhabit it. The nervous system gradually learns to move without panic. Pleasure becomes subtle but steady. Even discomfort changes texture. It no longer feels like threat, but like weather passing through. Jung warned that many remain trapped in the liminal phase because they romanticize the death but resist the rebirth. It is easier to inhabit the identity of the one who has seen through the world than to actually re-enter life without illusion. The desire not to exist can quietly become a refuge, a way to avoid the vulnerability of participating again. But participation now carries a different quality. You no longer barter yourself for validation, and you no longer chase reflections of worth. You engage because something in you resonates, not because something in you lacks. This is also where the shadow returns in a new form. Earlier, it was dismantled alongside the ego. Now it reappears as raw vitality, anger, passion, desire, creative force, all resurfacing without the old distortions. Not suppressed, not compulsive, but integrated. The shadow stops functioning as an enemy and begins behaving like power with conscience. People describe this phase as ordinary life with unfamiliar depth. You still work, you still relate, you still choose, but the inner posture has transformed. You are less impressed by the world, yet more intimate with it. You need less from it, yet feel more within it. From a spiritual angle, this is what many traditions call returning to the marketplace after the vision on the mountain. You no longer seek transcendence as escape. You live as awareness within form. The mystical becomes practical. The cosmic becomes human. And this is perhaps the greatest revelation in the entire process. The desire not to exist was never pointing toward absence. It was pointing toward a new way of existing that hadn't yet taken shape. What dissolves during ego death isn't life. It is the idea of life you are unconsciously serving. Once that dissolves, existence must be rediscovered without pre-written meaning. That rediscovery takes time because the psyche doesn't move by insight alone. It moves by rhythm, by regulation, and by gradual trust in a new inner gravity. Gradually, the nervous system learns that being here no longer requires performance. The heart learns to attach without losing itself, and the mind learns to rest without collapsing. Slowly, the will returns, not as pressure but as preference. You begin choosing again, not because you must, but because something inside now leans toward life in a cleaner way. Jung called this individuation, the movement toward becoming what you were before fear taught you who you should be. Not perfection, not enlightenment as costume, but coherence, a life where inner and outer no longer fight. The desire not to exist was a message from the depths, not a verdict. It was the psyche declaring the old version of living is no longer viable. Once that message is listened to rather than resisted, existence reorganizes itself around a quieter, truer center. You don't return to who you were. You return as someone who no longer needs to leave themselves to live. If any part of this resonated with where you are right now, I'd welcome hearing your story. What has been the most challenging or confusing aspect of your awakening so far? The emptiness, the loss of drive, the identity shift, or something else entirely? Share it in the comments. So you're not carrying it alone, and if you want to continue exploring the deeper dimensions of the psyche, transformation, and what it truly means to awaken in everyday life, make sure to subscribe to Fractal Wisdom.